So I'd like to welcome you to the third in this series of grief support videos that I'm creating for YouTube. And today what we're going to be doing is talking a little bit about some facts about grief. And hopefully by me sharing some of these facts, you might be able to recognize some of the things that you're going through right now in your grief process. But also, another benefit to all of this is that you're going to be able to be ready for these experiences if they present themselves. Now, there's no guarantee that you're going to be feeling all of these things, all through the process. And so that's the danger. The danger sometimes is that we need to realize that not everyone goes through grief the same way. And so some of the things that I'll be describing today in this video might be something that you're feeling, something that you are going through, but there are other things that you might not even come across in your grief process. So kind of be aware of that. So I'm talking more, I guess, in general terms than I would be more specific. But I have to tell you that when I do grief support at the parish, and I've done grief support in the past, not only as far as getting groups together and doing grief support with groups, but also individuals coming in and processing their grief with me. One of the questions that I'm more than likely almost always asked is what I am going through right now, what I'm feeling, what I'm going through, the experiences that I'm having, all of those things, is that normal? And, my answer is always the same. Well, it's normal for you because your grief experience is unique. It's unique and it's unlike any others. So, yes, what you're going through is normal. But there are some things that we're going to be talking about today that are kind of normal across the spectrum. And that's kind of the point that I'm trying to make. And so I want them to know, first of all, what they're experiencing at this particular time in their life is normal. Because grief, especially if you haven't experienced it before, is something that seems so abnormal. In other words, we like to have control of our lives. We like to be in control of things. We like to know what's going to happen next. We'd like to know, how our day is going to go. And when we talk about grief, we talk about the fact that death and grief and major illness and final illness always puts things so out of control. And so when we arrive at grief, and when we are grieving, we want to glamour on to that sense of control. We want to control certain things about our life. And so that's the process. The process is, well, we're coming in, we're making choices, and we're making choices about funerals, and we're making choices about luncheons, and all of those things that kind of surround the funeral day. But also, we're also making choices about what we eat, about what we do during our day. So to give you an example, going through and saying, okay, well, it's 2 weeks, I've grieved for 2 weeks, am I ready to go back to work? Those are things that kind of all come up and say, well, I want to get that sense of control, that sense of normalcy back. And so it comes to the realization then, though, through all of this, is that we can't control the death, and we can't control the final illness. And so part of grief, and this is the first fact of the day, part of grief is learning to accept that reality. Learning to accept the reality that we can't control death and that we can't control that final illness. So let's talk a little bit about why we grieve. Well, I think we grieve because, first of all, we need an explanation. We need an explanation for why the person is so sick. We need an explanation for why the person has died. And it goes beyond just the physical death. We all know very intellectually that we're all going to die someday and everything dies, but we have to realize that we go beyond those questions And sometimes we begin to ask the bigger questions like the God questions. Why, God, did you cause this to happen? Why me at this particular time in my life? What's next? You know, there's the whole complicated grief. Is there another shoe that's going to drop down? On us at this particular time. So we talk about that many times, and I'd like to share with you an experience of complicated grief that I experienced myself. My wife and I did. So over the course of a 6-year period, my wife and I experienced the death of her mother, my mother, my father, her grandmother, my grandmother, and her aunt. So over the period of about 6 or 7 years, my wife and I lost everyone in our family. And it's very difficult. Not, we each have sisters, so we have our sisters, and obviously we have our children. But we went from being children one day to being the patriarch and the matriarch of the family. And so the complicated grief that surrounded that begged the question, what's next? What's going to happen next? We just get done with burying one person, and then all of a sudden another person gets sick. And so that's the complicated grief. And those are the questions that kind of are brought up when we talk about why we grieve. And so what's ultimately then in store for me? The other thing, another fact of grief, is that it hurts. And it's supposed to hurt. I always tell people in homilies when I'm preaching at funeral masses or funeral services that, you're crying and you're upset and you're sad, and that's okay. That's a normal feeling because it shows how much you care. We love as human beings. We love other people, and other people love us. And because we love, because we have that capability, when we lose someone physically, that becomes a question then of, yes, it's going to hurt. And we still love that person even though they're not physically with us. And so that's another thing, that, it hurts because they're not with us, but that means that the love for them never ever diminishes. It also goes to the fact that it's going to continue to hurt. So even after a period of time has passed, and you go through that time period and you go through the process, and you kind of think to yourself, okay, I'm not over it, but I'm close to it. I'm processing it, and I'm doing what I need to do. And then you have a symbolic loss that comes up. You have a situation that will come up, for example, with a daughter who has lost her father, and then next thing you know, she gets engaged and she's getting ready to get married, and the father is not there to walk her down the aisle. That's a symbolic loss. That's a symbolic loss. And so we talk about what happens during this time, during this hurt time. Well, sometimes what happens is we cry at unexpected times. We'll see something, or we'll hear something. We'll hear a song on a radio, or we'll come across a smell, or we'll come across a favorite food, or we'll come across a holiday season or a birthday, and then all of a sudden our mood will change and we'll begin to cry. And that is okay. That's okay. That's normal. And then we also, at this particular part of it hurting, is that we feel the need to tell the story over and over and over and over again. And many times we tell the same stories over and over and over again about that loved one. And that's okay. And that's normal as well. And then we also have to realize, too, at times, the next fact. And the next fact is that life will never, ever be the same. It affects every aspect of our life, the death does. It affects our family, affects our family makeup. It affects our environment, where we live, how we go about our day. It affects our finances many times. A lot of times we see when spouses die, that maybe the man was the one that took care of all the finances in the house. And then all of a sudden the wife who hasn't done a checkbook in years, she's the one that is thrust into the idea of having to take care of the checking account and take care of all the finances. And it becomes overwhelming. And so, we have to realize that life is changing. Life is never ever going to be the same. And a lot of times when that happens, when we're kind of left alone to kind of do some of these things, there's anger that builds up. There's anger at being left alone. There's anger at family members and at other people who don't share in the grief that you have. And that could manifest itself in the fact that, well, maybe again using the example of a spouse, maybe the wife has lost her husband and the children have already moved on from their grief and they're back to their normal life and everything going on, but yet the wife and the mother is left alone home in the house. Well, there's anger that comes up and that builds up over that. There's also anger at the loved one themselves for leaving them. The anger at the loved one for leaving them too soon, maybe, or maybe unexpectedly. And so, and then when we have that anger at our loved one who has passed away, there's sometimes a sense of guilt. Why am I feeling angry at somebody who has died? There is even an anger sometimes at the medical people, feeling that the medical people and the doctors and the nurses didn't do enough, that they didn't try hard enough to save our loved one. I experienced that, my sister experienced that more profoundly when our mother died. When our mother passed away, she had sepsis, and we felt, and my sister more so felt that, the doctors and the nurses could have done more to control that infection. When in fact, after we found out for a while that my mother had cancer in her body, and there was nothing that we would have been able to do anyway. But we were angry at that medical profession, of those medical people at that time. And then also when it comes to the fact that life will never be the same, our moods will change. Our mood will change at the drop of a hat over the slightest thing. When things don't go the way that we want them to, when things are out of what we seem out of control, well, our mood will change over the littlest thing. And again, all of these feelings, all of these experiences are normal. And then the rest of the world doesn't feel the same. And this is a hard fact to take, that everybody grieves at their own pace. But a lot of times we feel that people should be grieving a little bit more and kind of sharing in our pain. And they don't at times. And so we'll talk a little bit more about this in episode 4, because we're going to be talking about what are good things to say to someone who has experienced a loss, and what are sort of not so good things to say, and what people say and how we're to respond to them. But that's something, again, that the rest of the world really doesn't feel the same way that we do. And so what happens is we get restless and we look for an activity, but we can't concentrate on that activity. We have so many things so much stuff going on that we have to move from one thing to another, and we never seem to finish anything. We have a preoccupation with the life of the deceased. We have, maybe assuming mannerisms of the deceased, and we compensate. We compensate for people being uncomfortable around us. And so, when people come up to us and say, well, are you doing okay? People will say, yeah, I'm doing okay, when in fact they're really in pain and they're really hurting. And then finally, friends and family can be supportive at times. But, sometimes they won't be. And we have to kind of accept that. What happens during a death, what happens during a final illness, brings everything to the forefront. We see that all the time when we minister to people in funerals and wakes and during the last illnesses, is that, we see that if there was dissension in the family beforehand, that is going to be something that is going to be brought to the forefront and brought to the forefront during that time, during the time of grief. And so that dissension is going to come up again. And if you want people to listen to you, and you have never had that before in your family, you want to be able to tell people, you want to have open lines of communication, When of all those things and you've never had that before, you can't expect it to happen during a death, because a death is a life-changing event. And so we have to avoid unrealistic expectations of people. People are going to be the way that they're going to be, and we can't force them to change during a death or during a mourning period. So what I'd like you to do with this particular video, as we're coming to an end here, is maybe share some of the facts that you have experienced. Share them in the comments section. And I promise that during the time that when you share those in the comments section, that I will take the time. I will take the time to respond to each one of them. Because I think, like I've said, over the years and through support groups and things like that, support groups are ways of people kind of trying to come to a realization and an understanding. And so if we come and we share those things with each other, all of us are going to be healthy, and all of us will be helped by some of the things that we do. So finally, I'd like to leave you with a blessing. And the blessing is that, we talk in the funeral rites of the church, that life has changed, not ended. And that is truly, truly the case with a Christian, with someone who is a follower of God, who is with God during the course of their earthly life. They are certainly going to be with him forever in heaven. Yes. May God bless you. May God keep you close to him during this time of grief. And may also God watch over the soul of those you have lost. God bless you.